1933, Nintendo on its first make into a full-line factory next door. Streamlined Nintendo's car manufacturing and their production to the national demand. Further expansion occurred in 1947 when Nintendo established their lines. The team was specifically in toy shops around Japan, allowing Nintendo to bring to the pro. This expansion secured Nintendo's success in the 30s and 40s. Unfortunately, Communist tenure at Nintendo would be cut short. Suffered a stroke in 1948, retired as the following year, but later passed on February 2nd, 1949. His death, however, was not a year for Nintendo, and found one day his 22-year-old grandson, Yamauchi. Yamauchi proved to be the most influential in Nintendo's history and would take the company to new markets, industries, and heights under his tenure. Yamauchi just followed a well-trained path and focused primarily on playing cards. In 1953, Nintendo became the first company in Japan to produce plastic-backed cards. This modernized the production and gave them a more appealing product compared to imported cards. Yamauchi's first major success was in 1959, when Nintendo secured a license to make toys, board games, and of course playing cards would all be endorsed with Disney characters. Western cartoons like Mickey Mouse and Popeye were very popular in Japan, and Nintendo's brand products were similarly popular, and their primary focus, thanks to this brand, selling records 600,000 packs. While Nintendo would become a big fish, Yamauchi regularly was entirely small. There was only so much demand and Yamauchi had great visions for Nintendo. In 1962, Yamauchi and Nintendo Public began a series of expansions into different markets. One of Nintendo's first pursuits was a series of single-service device, home instant noodles. So the charitable time failed. Their device was apparently quality and really took off. Nintendo would also start a taxi service in this item. It was initially successful, but managed to business meeting to house taxi unions and better compensation and benefits. Tired of dealing with these unions, Yamauchi perhaps the most unusual business from Nintendo at this time was a number of love hotels operating around Kyoto. The first mention of this business comes from the 1994 book Game Over, how Nintendo covered the world. And while it's often seen as a simple word, the love hotel claim is difficult to corroborate. Whether it's an urban legend, culture fact, or somewhere in between. But that, in the 1960s, Nintendo was on the brink of bankruptcy due to these many adventures. Yamauchi focused the company away from miscellaneous industries and solely on entertainment. And I hired one Yokoi to oversee their production. Yokoi was a often built small toys and attractions on his time off. A slow chance. Yamauchi visited Yokoi one day and saw a toy he had been working on, a claw with an accidentally let us throw. Yamauchi was genuinely impressed with the toy and moved Yokoi to Nintendo's department. Here, Yokoi researched Hiroshi Imanishi developed new toys and products for Nintendo. The first product from him was design and called the Ultra Hand. The toy was an instant hit and would go on to be Nintendo's to sell over 1 million units. Other popular toys to come from Yokoi at this time included the Ultra Machine, a baseball thrower, and the Love Tester, essentially a circuit replaced by a grabbing machine and pulling hands with some. Yokoi's toys were incredibly popular. There's no exaggeration to say they pulled Nintendo back from the brink. Time advancement in electronics and computer technology. Yamauchi realized huge potential in these developments. He needed his employees to utilize this technology. Nintendo would quickly see success in this entire era. Uemura was an electrical engineer and worker for sure. He visited Nintendo and hopefully sell his company's latest items. He probably quickly saw potential applications for these items and hired Uemura away from Sharp to help in this pursuit. Their basic idea was to use solar cells as targets that would be hit with light to make the phone shoot about the technology. The result was the Nintendo Beam Gun, first released in 1970. An instant hit and another seller. So popular was the Beam Gun, Nintendo decided to scale up on the technology. Speed shooting was a popular sport in the 70s, but not many people had access to. these glowing eyes for cheap. They convert and simulated engines. A novel and ambitious plan that was to be the snapper named laser clay shooting system. Laser clay debuted in 1973 and was an overnight success. His bullet ranges were to the brim. He could be usually had another success in advance. Unfortunately, laser clay's popularity would be tragically short-lived. That same year, Japan's economy would experience a sharp decline thanks to the 19th crisis. Households were more focused on basic necessities than on attraction. And most of the mass investment in laser clay company was the breakthrough bankruptcy. And his versatility avoided a bunch of bankruptcy or need to salvage their laser gun offerings. They would scale down laser clay. I guess it would work as an arcade cabinet and release their mini laser clay. They would also release a shooter called Wild Gun. Your goal was to win with your life. Both cabinet offerings were popular in their own right, but couldn't pull Nintendo out of the themselves. Company turned towards more developments known as specifically holiday consoles. Bowie Nintendo. He secured the PC Nintendo's first home consoles, the TV series. The first in the series was the Color TV Game 6, released in 1977. It was essentially a Pong machine. Pong was a really big deal when it came out. It's kind of the only video game their TV consoles would be released on the TV. Essentially more Pong, break racing game, built-in wheel, and lottery, bring up colors and a few different layouts. While many includes, they offered variations of the original formula to keep things fresh quite well. In addition, Nintendo produced these consoles for cheap and kept the retail price of them very high, allowing them to run systems. Thanks to this, the Color TV series was a resounding success for Nintendo, and sold over 3 million consoles across all versions. Color TV was the first of Nintendo's successes in the new field of video games, and its second would come from none other than Bowie. The Color console followed a particular philosophy. He turned Isaac to behave or lateral thinking with seasoned technology. Things again as a team developed mature technologies and repurposed them to create a new product for a new niche. In the late 70s, he was writing that so computer electronics had reached this level of miniaturization. Technology for Nintendo. It was released in 1980. The novelty came from these games. It was 40 million units. It's a limited development span. The success of the Game & Watch was just what Nintendo needed. Experimental technology and expanded games. With Color TV and the Game & Watch was a smash hit. The members of the arcade scene left much to be desired. Arcades made a global commitment in the 70s and early 80s, but Nintendo never performed very well in the market. The problem was Nintendo's early arcade offerings were rather unimpressive or uninspired. The first arcade cabinet Nintendo put on the market was the 1978 Computer Othello, a digitized form of the strategy board. While the game was popular in Japan and the large arcade cabinet, it wasn't the hottest item. Nintendo wouldn't press on, however, to turn their hand on the arcade market. They would release games such as Monkey Magic, Breakout Clone, Space Invaders, Apes, Sheriff, a game that took heavy inspiration from Space Invaders. Nintendo was well aware of their copycat tendencies and had not issued a machine practice. The unoriginality in Nintendo's arcade titles would be reflected in their performance. Nintendo would see further setbacks in 1980 due to their commercial years ago. While clearly being inspired by Space Invaders, was initially received from Japan, only clearly well in the United States, and did a major advertising push for Raiders in the US. Unfortunately, by the time it arrived in the US, there was little interest in the game. The Space Invaders trains had been replaced with mass market America, and over 3,000 Raiders soon used, only the pass had actually sold. The failure of Raiders soon, and Nintendo's enduring inability to bring to the American market, vexed Yamauchi. Nintendo was in need of a market, Departments right after 1979 share Nintendo. Created one Nintendo. Yamaguchi would call on him in 1981, but expressed Nintendo's need for a breakout title and asked Miyamoto to lead that project. Miyamoto quickly and casually accepted the challenge and set out to make what would eventually be Donkey Kong. Donkey Kong is a project would be painstakingly poured over by Miyamoto and his team, and was in many ways a culmination of game design at the time. Miyamoto was an avid gamer himself, and had his background in industrial design. Donkey Kong is truly impressive, and that it achieves these lofty goals almost effortlessly. The player, your objective, and the obstacles instantly. Each of these tutorials, and now you have to climb ladders, turns or waterfalls, and save your girlfriend. The gameplay itself is challenging. Barrels, springs, and waterfalls are just enough to keep the player engaged and at their toes. The game also functions much like hard balance and tension, and giving players a moment of control. Furthermore, Donkey Kong wasn't just fun to play, but also fun to hear. The cheery sounds and infectious gameplay would and all heart works of Donkey Kong. Its popularity. Donkey Kong has been tried much more intelligently than prior attempts at Nintendo. Pac-Man was going gangbusters in the world in 1981, and there wasn't even enough characters. Popeye characters, with Popeye as our hero, Pluto the villain, and all of them will be damsel in distress. Due to the slow process of licensing, with the technical difficulties of making a realistic Popeye, the original characters of Donkey Kong, Lady, and Jumpman were used instead. To be popular and effective, Jumpman was one of the first arcade characters to be humanoid, and Donkey Kong's soft design was inviting and received. The numerous factors that made Donkey Kong culminated in a game that wasn't popular or televised on Nintendo. Pac-Man was going gangbusters around the world in 1981, and there was a general interest in mascot characters. Miyamoto initially planned to make the game with Popeye characters, Pluto the villain, and Olive Oil being damsel in distress. Due to the slow process of licensing, coupled with the technical difficulties of making a realistic Popeye, the original characters of Donkey Kong, Lady, and Jumpman were used instead. This proved to be popular and effective. Jumpman was the characters humanoid, and Donkey Kong's more sympathetic design was and well received. The numerous factors that made Donkey Kong culminated in a game that was impossible to put down, and Nintendo saw this very early on. It was released in Japan. Nintendo's playtest was lasting long after the show was returned. A very positive sign for Nintendo, if a little unhealthy. Donkey Kong would be released in Japan in July 1981 to immediate success. It would become Japan's first arcade game for the year. As the Japanese release was, the release of Donkey Kong was even more spectacular. Also released in July 1981, would sell over 85,000 units in the US in just 8 months. Donkey Kong would also see minor localization changes. And Jumpman was made a caricature and given the name Mario. The basis of the is the Outer Warehouse. Mario said, the name just suffered despite Simone's protestations. Also in Mario is the pub is not limited to arcades. They ported the game to their Game & Watch in 1982. Console ports were done through Coleco the same year. They saw the ones of DK and Mario merchandise from the pub. Nintendo would also develop numerous popular sequels to Donkey Kong, Jr., Donkey Kong 3, and Mario Bros. Mario Bros is interesting because it introduced Mario's brother, Luigi, a player 2 for competitive or cooperative play. The name Luigi is also Italian, but also comes from the Japanese word Fruigi, meaning similar. This was appropriate, as Luigi was a palette swap of Mario with the same gameplay, and also because he was Mario's brother. All in all, the absolute success of Donkey Kong and its spin-offs was well beyond Nintendo's expectations. It was the mega hit young in which Miyamoto's first entry in the world of gaming. As Nintendo was seeing runaway success in arcades and making in millions from Game & Watch, the console offerings had fallen off by the 80s. The Kong TV series was successful and but had diminished in popularity as new second-gen consoles hit the market. Yamaguchi, hoping to regain the month Uemura to design a new console. Yamaguchi's specifications were stringent. He wanted something that wasn't just bigger, but substantially cheaper than any other console on the market. Uemura, this task for close to 2 years. They worked with various semiconductor companies to design and test chips for this console, raise process to meet Yamauchi's rigid demands. They were quickly culminating the Nintendo family computer, known as the Famicom. Released in July '83, the Famicom was sold for half the price of their competitors and had massive selling points. Everything seemed to be going fine. Nintendo had yet smashed it and began to dominate yet another industry. Unfortunately, Nintendo quickly ran into a snag with the Famicom. There was a big issue with its graphics chip, which would lead to system crashes and an unusable console when certain games were played. This came at the worst possible time as well. Nintendo their flagship product was at tremendous cost. Yamauchi announced to repair faulty hardware. Plus, the fortunately Nintendo was able to salvage both the Famicom and their reputation. Until it's in nearly 3 million in 1984, and 6.5 million in 1985. It continued to sell millions of Japanese, and Nintendo would totally dominate Japanese consoles in this time. Its popularity was thanks not just to the power and affordability of the console, but the wide selection of games on it. Nintendo released the Famicom with near perfect performance of its arcade titles, popular and just as popular on the console. Nintendo would initially be able to do certain games for the Famicom, either licensing games for other studios in mid-1984. To gain the same popularity of the console itself, coupled with exclusivity contracts for these third parties, the Famicom became the go-to console for quality games. All in all, the Famicom sold over 19 million units in Japan. Nintendo may have sold throughout the country. The Japanese video game moved to the Nintendo American market was constant. The video game crash in 1983 saw a massive decline in the American industry. The primary reason of this crash was the oversaturation of home console and low-quality games, and consumer confidence in the games industry. There was a 6% drop in console and game sales, along with slight declines. Yamauchi was confident the Famicom no one requiring entire touch. Firstly, Nintendo introduced the Versus system to the United States in 1984. The Versus system was a series of arcade cabinets that were Famicom hardware, playing slightly modified Famicom games. These cabinets had multiple sets of controls and were designed for multiplayer competitive play, hence the Versus. Games on these cabinets were readily and easily changeable as well. About how to improve it, Versus system arcade versus gamers enjoy the competitive nature of the Versus system sold 21 Versus cabinets by the end of 1984 and was sold thousands more in the following years. The Versus system hardware, software, and markets without releasing the console. Due to the success of the Versus system, Nintendo was confident the American market positively to the Famicom. Stigma surrounding games in the video game industry. In an effort to circumvent the stigma, Nintendo would completely redesign the console for American audiences. The first change would be in the name. Nintendo would call their console the Nintendo Entertainment System. It wasn't a computer. It wasn't a video game. It was a fun, toy-like device, at least in terms of marketing. Nintendo would further lean into the toy aspects of their console by harping on features like the zapper and drop. In addition, the NES itself was explicitly designed to not look like a video game console. Cartridges were released from the top like other consoles, with runners and VCR. All this was done to make it light on the NES, not for limitations of video games. With the Famicom finally redesigned for American audiences, Nintendo made preparations to release their NES. Nintendo's US branch initially released the original audience, New York City. NYC was chosen not because to sell it everywhere, but because it would be hard. NYC was heavily competitive in the market. 1983. If the NES could succeed in New York City, Yamauchi thought that it would succeed across the US. First on October 18th, 1985, NES sales in New York were frankly middling. Of the 100,000 units shipped to the US, only half had sold by 1986. Yamauchi and NOA were not deterred, however, and began selling the NES in other cities around the US. Their second test market was Los Angeles in February 1986, where sales were steady and promising. Nintendo would continue expanding to cities around the US before finally going national on September 7th, 1987. 3 million units in 1987, 7 million in 1988. By 1989, the NES was in US households, and by 1990, would be an egregious understatement. Far beyond Nintendo's expectations, effectively resurrecting the US video game industry and putting Nintendo in charge. This massive success can be attributed to a number of factors. First and foremost, you had to find a way to promote the NES. NOA worked tirelessly to convince stores and shopkeepers to stock the NES, and we spared no expense in advertising and exploiting Nintendo for the new market. These advertisements aimed to turn the NES into a video game competition. Rather than as advertising forefront, you were purchasing packages, a game pass, console, and an entertainment. It was a tremendous approach and it proved very successful. On a technical level, the NES was substantially better than any other console. This is the most common scenes. The graphics were excellent for the time, and the console was sold at a affordable price. However, there was one specific difference that set it apart from previous consoles: lockout. Consoles that being very users had no protections from locks and outages. You could do whatever you wanted and sell on the open market. The game was actually good. The unregulated nature of second-generation consoles led to a glut of boring titles. Nintendo would not repeat these mistakes, and implemented a version of their consoles. The 10NES system was a completely developed NES consoles non-licensed titles for NES. Games had to be licensed to Nintendo, specifically Yamaha. Here's Yamaha was a gamer himself, but he was renowned for his ability to make out games that would be sensations. This dovetails into perhaps the biggest selling point of the NES, its massive library of excellent games. Legend of Zelda, Metroid, Excitebike, Duck Hunt, Gun, Dragon Quest, Punch-Out, and of course, Nintendo's crown jewel, Super Mario Bros. Super Mario Bros. Was released with multiple variants. It was the single highest selling game on the console. Developed by Shigeru Miyamoto, the success of all Super Mario could be attributed to excellent design. That holds up today. World 1 of Super Mario Bros. Presents everyone a new challenge in the game right out the gate. Defeating enemies, acquiring power-ups, overcoming obstacles, the game forces players to figure things out without even realizing it. This subtle, masterful design gives players the basics for the rest of the game and allows them to improve their skills throughout the game's 32 levels. Another factor in Super Mario 3 was the music. We worked close with composer to develop the soundtrack for Super Mario. Inspiration for jazz funk when composing, its influences can be tried in the final product. Was treated with respect and deserved. Its quality and catchiness are the most iconic aspects of Super Mario. The game would go on to sell 40 million copies during the NES's run, and Mario became a cult icon across the United States. The sense of Super Mario Bros. And its subconscious resulted in huge merchandising as well. Plushes, boxes, fruit snacks, cereal, sweaters, playing cards, brushes, beach towels, cups, and Bible art, all be adorned with Nintendo's new mascot. Thanks in large part to Mario, the NES was an unbelievable success for Nintendo. It would sell nearly 62 million units around the world. Perhaps more impressively, the NES managed to resurrect gaming in America, cementing Nintendo as a major player in gaming worldwide. While the NES was going gangbusters across Japan, Nintendo began to scale back their G business. Partly to the insane popularity of Famicom and the NES, but also due to recent laws passed in Japan. Being businesses affected public morals regulated out. Fumeiho, first passed in 1948, saying it to other forms of entertainment. The law in 1984 various gaming operations with the goal of illegal gambling. However, due to the vague wording and inconsistent enforcement of the law, many legends of its higher the law was not to upstream elections on arcades. Under 16 couldn't play after 6 p.m. and arcades in general had to close by midnight. And restrictions in Japanese arcades and due to this, I would expect their arcade offerings to be less professional. Japanese arcade operators would sell their cabinets overseas and compete in those regional Nintendo was solely on their foreign markets. To that end, Nintendo would release their games in 1986 with this. Likewise, Nintendo was essentially its first system to play games on cabinets. Choice would continue to advertise coming NES titles as well. Super Mario Bros. 3 would debut on arcades. Play choices would slow advertising its games and advertise and to be it would never reach the same popularity versus system. The competitive aspects of the system seems to appeal to the sheer variety of players today. While Nintendo product had stopped developing arcade games, they would continue to produce subsidiaries. But a surprise. The graphics in the game were exceptional at the time, but the graphics aesthetics were a huge appeal. The gameplay itself and of course, the biggest draws. Our time was in success, but Nintendo wasn't all that arcade business in the 80s and focused more on consoles and mobile offerings. Nintendo continued producing and selling new game watches. Fairly item, simple design, even aged by the 80s. Nintendo understood those values, however, they would follow on the Game Boy. Designed by Yoko and Nintendo veteran Jiro Nakano, the Game Boy was a you had the variety however, it was less sophisticated compared to other handhelds at the time. It had no small screen. Nintendo won out over the competitors each time. The cheaper technology gave the handheld a price, and the Game Boy was more rugged and battery efficient. Just as the hardware will have up to the Game Boy was launched to be bundled with the system. And immediately, it was hugely popular in its own right. To Pokemon, Jerry, or interest and both encouraged and supported the development. After its development, Brain would be released in February 1906. Sales were initially slow, but they were selling over 1,000 million copies just in 1996. The simple premise of catch-a-ball Pokemon mechanics and in-person training made Pokemon a smash hit with the youth. Nintendo would very quickly capitalize on the popularity and market of Pokemon. Manga series and adaptation, a huge amount of merchandise in the first 2 years. The merchandise were a massive success. And when the Pokemon games actually produced in the US in 1998, would go on to sell. Just as the game was dominating in the 80s, the game was all time. The success of the game was unfortunately the departures thanks to its corporate business direction and was headed in publishing needed. was developed. Nintendo on August 10, 1996. It found its own company. Unfortunately, it would not follow this new company for long, as it has away from Japan 1997. It was a pivotal moment in its transition to entertainment, and it would be a source of many of Nintendo's this design philosophy would be Rogers even to today, and the years of Nintendo's pantheon. Now, Nintendo had largely moved out of arcades. Their console dominance had been challengers. Nintendo made a rival top spot after the release of the NES, but this dominance will last full 80s. The NES wasn't a technology release, but like 80s. Because the NES reinvigorated the games industry, you began to see increased competition in the console market. One of the biggest competitors at the time for Sega Genesis in the US and the markets. Challenger they couldn't ignore was a new console of their own. Nintendo had put more more powerful version starting in 1987. They released their Super Famicom in Japan out of was an all-around technical upgrade, had better sound and bigger games. The Super Famicom would also introduce rudimentary graphics with its 7, giving an impressive level of depth and detail. The Super Famicom being the preferred 4th-gen console in Japan, was on the same backdrop with the 4th-gen. However, the 16th version of the West has the Sega Genesis was the most popular console in the US. Nintendo would prefer the Super NES in 1991, facing stiff competition Genesis, and more specifically, was a game released in 1991. It was designed specifically for the American market. Video game designer Naoki Yoshima, Tanaka, decided was meant to have attitude to be the cool character in the video game scene. So was the Sega's numerous advertising campaigns, which makes their console the same cooler, more intelligent compared to it. Release it was one very the console sales in the West. Another important metric for the console console. In this regard, the Genesis one of the steps, so they were console. The success of the Genesis came out to track from the SNES, however, was a clear winner in Japan. The Genesis has a lot of memory of copies of models. Nintendo's Golden Goose would have several popular classics such as Star Fox and Mario. Donkey Kong would appear in it as well, and Rare's Donkey Kong Country would actually give the SNES a boost in North America. In total, the SNES would sell approximately 1 million in the total pet, the Genesis, and ultimately be considered one of the best consoles ever. 1996 would be the year Nintendo released their fifth-gen console, the Nintendo 64. Like with the 4th-gen, Nintendo was to provide an entry for the current console generation. Their rival would release their 6th in November of 1994. Released their PlayStation. They feuded with Sega since the 1980s, so much of the video game scene. Back in Nintendo would partner with Sony to produce peripherals for their upcoming Super Famicom and add on more grades and ROMs. It would also work on consoles on CDs called PlayStation. As early PlayStation wasn't distributing figures, it would be the sole manufacturer of music and movies on the platform, and be the owner of its CD format. She was a savvy and ruthless business leverage in this arrangement dropped the partnership with Sony. They want to work with Dutch manufacturer Philips for their SNES CD peripheral, and would ultimately be scrapped due to the failure of the Philips CD. So, on the other hand, they had been working on their PlayStation for a few years before being signed Nintendo and was sold to the market to the eventual Sony PlayStation. Back to Nintendo, they released their Nintendo 64 in Japan on June 23rd, 1996, and in North America on September 26th of the same year. The N64 from its 64-bit CD of 4 times the bandwidth, which allowed it to compete. The N64 was device, but initially slammed by June of the following year. Waiting for better launch titles to be developed. Super Mario 64. The hype and anticipation of 64 was substantial, and Nintendo would offer it. Upon its release, 64 was received well both in Japan and the United States, some of their competitors in the first few months. The N64 was launched with one of the most iconic entries in the Mario franchise in Nintendo's history, Super Mario 64. Super Mario 64 would be Mario's first adventure, immaculately translating Super Mario into the next dimension and would beautifully show off the capabilities of the N64. The world to explore was massive, and the gameplay was just fun. Its charm and sheer quality won numerous awards for SM64 and would ultimately be the highest selling game on the N64. It was the killer app for the N64, despite not being fun. It still drove huge sales for Nintendo. Going into 1997, the N64 was a serious round to a competitor, the PlayStation. Outside of the launch window, the N64 sales were a distant second to the and for reasons. The biggest the N64 faced was regarding games, mainly that it didn't have. Super Mario 64 was fantastic, but it was one of only 2 launch titles. This paltry variety of games was expensive in the N64's notoriously difficult game development. Coupled with the newness of technology, until the N64 if not infuriating. The steady production of first-party titles and disincentivized third parties from even bothering with the console. These would be further disincentivized from developing on the N64 due to the fact that you utilize cartridges for games. While cartridges had certain advantages for CDs, such as rapid load time and being harder to pirate, they also came with a slew of disadvantages. First and foremost is the cost. Cartridges are several times slower and more useful CDs. The higher cost and low returns from this printing up an N64 to help attract third parties to the console. In addition, N64 cartridges had most of the data on the CD, and as records for games if they wanted them. The unnecessary consumer enemy, and it also led to less platform practice on the N64. In short, limitations and frustrations on the N64 are these games away from the console. Outside of the software issues on the N64, Sony just did better business with the PlayStation. You see this just in the cost of both, whereas Nintendo would operate their consoles cheaper than the competition. Their N64 was always at the same price as the PlayStation. In fact, Sony would consistently slash prices on the PlayStation, leaving the N64 to play catch-up. The advantage Nintendo so often enjoyed was competitive by Sony, and it led to substantially greater sales per PlayStation. These consoles would be sold as the strategy is to consumers that could not process their game sales. While the N64 and PlayStation sold more than enough games to be profitable, the PlayStation had a much higher attach rate thanks to its larger and broader library. Part of this came from the PlayStation's better marketing and direction compared to the N64. While Nintendo stepped into a preteen audience, games with its advertisements, Sony would press the advantage to a more mature and product demographic. Nintendo's failure to capitalize on older gamers with the results of the year consoles allowed Sony to heavily capitalize on them. Ultimately, the N64 would still have a number of PlayStations in the US and Europe, and be made by using in Japan. The N64 faced somewhat of a console in the history of Nintendo. It was a success, but a bit one compared to prior consoles. It had some of the best games ever made, but missed out on just as many. It implemented new technologies, but its messages of the past were faded down. If the fourth generation challenged Nintendo's onslaught, the fifth generation wanted to threat them. Moving forward, Nintendo would be in a much more competitive is to gloss over Nintendo's popular generation entry, Virtual Boy. The Virtual Boy is a strange piece of keyboard, essentially a linear headset. The Virtual Boy hoped to give it a sense of 3D stereoscopy. Stereoscopy is a visual technique involving two images, both at the same time. One picture at its direct angle. If you position the two pictures close to your eyes, you generate the 3D image. The Virtual Boy would take this principle to use two small screens that would generate stereoscopic images in games. On the surface, the Virtual Boy seems like an interesting and Nintendo was really confident in the console. However, there were a number of fundamental flaws surrounding the console. Firstly, the Virtual Boy was somewhere between a mobile and home console, and would have performance. The Virtual Boy wasn't fully mobile. It required a stationary surface to actually be used, so playing it on the go was out of the question. It was more powerful than a mobile system would be on, but not nearly as good as any other fifth-gen console. It also only had one color, red. Nintendo did a color system to work, so red would be the only color on the system. This led to the cost. The Virtual Boy was priced between the Game Boy and full-on fifth-gen console because of the aforementioned issues and performance. Finally, the Virtual Boy would receive very little support from Nintendo. Good that Yukoi and his team were the only real developers on the Virtual Boy, with the rest of Nintendo focused on the N64. This led to them to rework the console instead. Somewhere, only used like 22 games in total. Upon its release in 1995, the Virtual Boy was immediately use. Total sales would top out at 770,000 worldwide, thanks in part to this suboptimal system, but also due to more advertising surrounding the console. Ultimately, the Virtual Boy would receive only 12 months of support before being scuttled in 1996 and written off as a total failure. All in all, the fifth generation for Nintendo was a bit of a mixed bag. The Game Boy Color was popular, the N64 underperformed. Virtual Boy was a joke. The sixth generation would be much the same. Nintendo would learn some lessons from the fifth gen to help modernize their offerings, and would falter in certain areas compared to their competitors. They would, however, start the 2000s out strong, one of their most successful consoles to date, the Game Boy Advance. The Game Boy Advance released for Japan in March of 2001, and for the rest of the world in June. The GBA would be a total upgrade over its Game Boy and Game Boy Color competitors, hence the Advance. Nintendo upgrades include a full-color LCD screen and a CD with this mess. One year improver, it's like a rechargeable battery pack and an actual backlight for the screen. The GBA would see success comparable to the original, thanks again to the myriad games offered on the handheld. Like with the first Game Boy, the most popular title in the GBA was the Pokemon series, and about 40 million copies of Pokemon were sold for the handheld. Outside of Pokemon, the GBA was home to a number of SNES and upgraded NES ports. This would introduce some of Nintendo's classics to a new generation, and be a big draw to the console. Finally, the GBA would have a number of non-Pokemon, non-port titles, all very popular in their own right. These include Superstar Saga, The Minish Cap, and Wario Land 4, Wario's greatest achievement. Outside of the variety and quality of its games, the GBA basically saw zero competition in the handheld market. The success of the original Game Boy killed off the competition, and seeing that the GBA was a flat upgrade over the original, it was an easy purchase for me. Priced at $99, the GBA was technically cheaper than the original on account of inflation, making it an affordable and highly attractive purchase. In addition, the GBA would come with a number of peripherals to either augment games on the system or give it uses outside of gaming. Examples include an MP3 player, cartridges with full movies or shows on them, and a glucose monitor for kids with diabetes. All in all, the GBA would sell over 81 million units over its 9-year lifespan, making it one of Nintendo's most successful consoles. While Nintendo's first handheld of the 21st century was a smash hit, their first home console left much to be desired. The Nintendo GameCube would be Nintendo's flagship console for the 6th gen. It would compete with the likes of Sony's PlayStation 2 and Microsoft's new Xbox. It was released for Japan in September 2001 and for the US in November that same year. The GameCube represented something of a claim from Nintendo's past consoles, both in terms of design and direction. The biggest and most obvious change is the GameCube's use of discs rather than cartridges. The GameCube was a much more graphically intensive console compared to the N64, which meant greater data storage was just a necessity. Furthermore, the costs and obnoxiously small data storage of cartridges was increasingly unpopular with third parties. This ties into Nintendo's other shifts with the GameCube. They made a much greater effort to support and appeal to third-party developers. The difficulty of developing for the N64, contrasted with the PlayStation's success with third-party games, meant that Nintendo needed third-party support for the GameCube to succeed. Furthermore, Nintendo would work to shake its family-friendly image at this time in order to attract a broader range of gamers and developers. While E-rated first-party games were plentiful on the console, they opened themselves up to plenty of third-party offerings with higher age ratings. While Nintendo had taken many steps forward with the GameCube, their competitors at Sony were still a few steps ahead. Their PlayStation 2 had two major advantages over the GameCube, with the first being an incredibly popular previous console. The PS1 was the single highest-selling console ever by 2000, the year of the PS2's release. The PS2 was also backwards compatible, meaning one's PS1 library could find a home on a more powerful console. Nintendo couldn't say the same. Their N64 was well received, but sold only around a third the number of PlayStations. Furthermore, you couldn't really pop in an N64 or SNES cartridge into the GameCube, meaning it would rely solely on its own library. The second advantage the PS2 had over the GameCube actually had nothing to do with games. It was the PS2's DVD player. In an era where all movies and shows are streamed or acquired online, It's worth emphasizing just how big a deal this was. DVD players at this time were very popular, but fairly expensive pieces of technology, costing around $200 to $300 in 2000. The PS2 was thus a unique and tantalizing proposition. It was a DVD player and next-gen console, all for $299 on release. The PS2 was the right product at the right time, and though Nintendo offered their GameCube for $100 less, this marquee feature was a make-or-break for many. It's worth noting the GameCube wasn't a bad console. It was technologically more impressive and less expensive than the PS2. It just lacked the features to realistically compete with Sony. Upon the GameCube's release in 2001, the response was lukewarm. The GameCube was a stark improvement over the N64, but it had a fairly unimpressive slate of launch titles. Whereas Nintendo's prior home consoles all shipped with some kind of killer app, the biggest title for the GameCube's launch was Luigi's Mansion is a great game, but it was not seen as some must-have title like Super Mario Bros. Or SM64. In fact, the game received some criticism for its relatively short length and for being a suboptimal first Mario game on the console. The GameCube started with a stumble, but would gradually improve its game library in the following years. Titles such as Super Mario Sunshine, The Legend of Zelda, The Wind Waker, and Metroid Prime were the titles the GameCube needed to stand out and actually bring people to the console. In spite of this, the GameCube continued to struggle in sales by 2003, mostly because the PS2 was still going strong and had dropped its price to $179. Nintendo would respond by slashing the GameCube's price in half to just $99, selling the GameCube for an even bigger loss. This would improve sales somewhat, but not nearly enough to overtake the PS2. The GameCube would again fall behind the PS2 and newly released Xbox as online play became increasingly popular. Titles such as Halo 2